I moved to a new city to study business at a local university, and I didn't want to burden my parents with my living expenses. So, once I'd settled into my apartment, I started looking for a job. Before long, I landed an overnight stocking job at a place called Fenwick Grocery. It's been almost 2 years since then, and I'm one of maybe 6 people who work between 11 at night and 7 in the morning, restocking a store big enough that most nights I don't see another human being for an hour at a stretch. The building splits roughly into two zones: grocery and general merchandise on one side, home goods and the small clothing section on the other. Whoever's scheduled usually works their half alone, while the other person handles theirs. That night, it was just me and a guy named James, him working the clothing and home goods side, and me on groceries. Both of us checking in over walkie every so often, out of habit more than necessity. The store only has a handful of employees working overnight on weekdays, with no manager on site after midnight, just 2 employees and a night porter who mops the front half of the store around 2 and leaves before either of us finishes our lists. The first 2 hours went the way they always do. I worked the cereal aisle, then canned goods, pushing a cart loaded with boxes down empty aisles under lights that buzz just loud enough to notice once everything else goes quiet. At night, the store had a specific kind of stillness to it, the hum of refrigerated cases, the occasional overhead announcement system clicking on and off for no reason. Nothing that ever struck me as strange before that shift. Around midnight, I radioed James to ask if he'd finished with the seasonal end caps near the fitting rooms, since I needed a pallet jack from that side of the building. He said he was still working through it, and while I waited by the front registers, I noticed the fitting room door standing shut with the little occupied slider flipped to red, locked from the inside. I didn't think anything of it at first. Sometimes staff use the fitting rooms to change into uniforms or store personal bags during a shift. I knocked anyway, said James's name, and got nothing back. When I radioed him directly, he told me he'd been nowhere near the fitting rooms in the last 20 minutes and had no idea why one would be locked, since nobody besides us was supposed to be in the building at all. He came over and used his master key to pop it open, and we found it completely empty. No bag, no jacket, nothing to explain the slider having ever been flipped red in the first place, which was only possible from inside. James laughed it off, said the lock mechanism was probably just faulty, something worth mentioning to the day manager in the morning. I agreed with him out loud and went back to my aisle, telling myself the same thing, though some part of me kept replaying how firmly that slider had clicked when I first tried the handle, like someone flipping it the moment I touched the handle. An hour later, doing my second sweep through the stockroom for more inventory, I found the staff-only door leading to the loading dock wide open, propped against the wall by nothing at all, just hanging loose on its hinge. That door gets locked at the start of every overnight shift, specifically because it leads out to an unlit dock area with no cameras covering the exterior side. I'd checked it myself at 11. It was part of my job, and it had been locked then. I called James again, and he confirmed he hadn't been anywhere near the loading dock either, and said he'd been restocking towels and clothes the entire last hour. We met up at the door together this time, and neither of us could explain how it had come unlocked without a key, since the store's dock doors use a key deadbolt from the inside with no accidental way to trip it open. We locked it again, and I noticed my hands weren't quite steady doing it, fumbling the key twice before it caught. James suggested calling it into the district on-call line, and I agreed, though the woman who picked up sounded more annoyed at being woken than concerned. Told us to just make sure everything was secure before we left, and log an incident report for the morning shift to review. We split back up after that, though we started checking in over the radio more often than the job actually required, every 15 minutes instead of every half hour. It was on one of my later sweeps, restocking the bread aisle around 2:30, that I found the sandwich. It sat wedged behind a row of bagged bread I'd fully stocked and organized less than an hour earlier. A sandwich in torn plastic wrap, half eaten, crumbs scattered across the shelf beneath it. I stood there staring at it longer than it made any sense, running through every possible explanation. A customer who'd somehow slipped it there during business hours, a coworker's forgotten snack, and landing on nothing that actually fit an aisle I'd personally straightened an hour ago and missed seeing it there. I radioed James immediately, and this time, neither of us bothered pretending the last 2 hours had any logical explanations behind them. We met up in the middle of the store, by the pharmacy counter, and decided together to walk the entire building side by side instead of splitting up again, flashlights out even with the overheads on, checking every aisle end and blind corner we could think of. We found the nest behind the seasonal display in the back corner of Home Goods, tucked between a stack of unopened patio furniture boxes and the wall, close enough to the loading dock door that the path made sense the moment we saw it. Blankets pulled from the linens aisle, price tags still attached to them, a pillow taken from bedding, empty wrappers from at least a dozen different snack items stacked in a neat little pile against the wall, like whoever had been living there took some pride in keeping their own space tidy, even while stealing everything in it. James found a torn employee badge holder shoved under one of the blankets, one that didn't belong to either of us, an old one from an employee who'd quit months earlier, according to the name still printed on the plastic. Neither of us touched anything after that. We walked straight to the front of the store, locked ourselves into the manager's office behind the registers, and called the police from there. 3 officers arrived within 10 minutes and searched the building floor by floor, with us pointing out where we'd found everything. They confirmed the nest, photographed it, pulled the badge holder as evidence, and searched every stockroom, every restroom, every blind corner a person could possibly fold themselves into. They found no one. One of the officers told us it looked like whoever had been staying there had cleared out fast, probably slipping through the dock door sometime in the last hour, and that they will be flagging the store for extra patrols and recommending better door alarms to corporate. Corporate sent someone out the next afternoon to review camera footage from the exterior dock area, the one spot in the building without interior coverage, and found nothing usable, a blind angle that had apparently been blind for longer than anyone currently working there could explain. They installed a motion light within the week and left it at that. I picked up day shifts after that for a while, told the scheduling office I needed a break from nights without going into the full reason why. James transferred to a different store entirely, and I never got the chance to ask him whether he still thought about that badge holder as often as I did. The store never found out who'd been living behind that seasonal display, how long they'd actually been there before that night, or where they went once the dock door started sounding an alarm instead of standing open for the taking. I still shop there often during the day, and I always find myself glancing down the home goods aisle, expecting to see a pile of blankets tucked in some corner that was supposedly cleared out and empty a long time ago. I've worked the overnight shift at Ridgemont Behavioral Health for 3 years, working in a locked unit called Ward B. It was made for long-term patients who need more supervision than the general floors. The ward runs on a rhythm most people outside this job never think about. People were admitted and discharged in waves tied to intake schedules and insurance cycles, which means most months bring at least 1 or 2 new admissions in the first week, transfers from other facilities, patients stepping down from acute care, the occasional long-term placement from a family who can't manage things at home anymore. You get used to a new face every few weeks. It stops being notable after the first year. Ward B holds 11 beds. On paper, my job is simple. Every hour throughout the night, I do the same routine. Walk the hall, glance into each room, note anyone awake, check the common room, log it, and repeat. New patients get an extra note on the chart for their first month. More frequent checks, closer attention to adjustment, standard protocol for anyone still settling into a locked unit for the first time. The patient came in on the first Monday of March, transferred from a facility 2 counties over, a man in his 40s named Elias Harmon, according to the intake sheet. Quiet during the admission interview, according to the day nurse who processed him. Diagnosis vague enough on the chart that I didn't think much of it. His first few nights were unremarkable in the most literal sense. Slept through most checks, sat up reading during others. Nothing that set him apart from any other new admission I'd watched settle into that ward over the years. The first odd thing happened on his 4th night. I did my midnight check and found him standing in the corner of his room, facing the wall, instead of asleep in bed, arms hanging straight at his sides, not moving even slightly when I knocked lightly on the door frame. Some patients do this. Catatonic episodes aren't unheard of on a ward like ours, and a man standing still in a corner, unsettling as it looked, it was something I'd seen before with other patients over the years. I logged it on the sheet and moved on. He was in the exact same position at my 1 o'clock check. Same at 2. By 3, I'd started timing how long a person could reasonably hold that position without any tremor, any shift of weight, any of the small, unconscious movement a human body makes, even standing still. And I couldn't come up with an answer that made me feel better about logging it a 3rd time. Nothing happened the following week, and I convinced myself it had just been one odd night. Then, 10 days later, the counts stopped making sense. I did my 2 o'clock round and found him sitting on top of the room's windowsill. A narrow ledge, maybe 8 inches deep, 7 feet off the ground with no chair, no stool, nothing in that bare room he could have used to climb up there. He sat cross-legged, facing out toward the hall through the small wired glass window in the door, spine straight, hands resting flat on his knees, as still as he'd been standing in the corner 2 weeks earlier. There was nothing beneath him to climb onto the window. I stood in the doorway trying to figure out some way a grown man could have gotten up there without a running start and a wall to brace against, and never landed on one that made sense. I called the nurse's station instead of going in alone. Renata came down to see for herself, and I watched her stop dead in the doorway the same way I had, both of us standing there stunned. For a solid minute, neither of us said anything, still staring at the man on the window. She didn't try to talk him down. Neither did I. We stood outside the door until he climbed down on his own, slow and deliberate, sometime past 2:30, and got back into bed without a single word passing between any of us. Renata brought it up to the charge nurse the next morning, and the answer we got back treated the whole thing like a footnote. Patients climb things sometimes, log it, monitor for injury risk, and request a bed rail if it keeps happening. Nobody seemed interested in how a man sedated for sleep had gotten up onto a ledge that high without so much as a scuff mark on the wall underneath it. The worst night came at the end of that week. I walked my 1 o'clock round and glanced into his room the way I had 11 times before that same shift. And he wasn't in the corner. He wasn't on the windowsill. He wasn't in bed. I took a step back to get a better look inside. That's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the doorway, close enough that if I'd walked a couple more steps into the room, I would have run straight into him. I did the welfare check because protocol required it, hand tight around my radio the whole way across the room. When I touched his shoulder to get a response, there was no give under my hand at all. No warmth, no small rise and fall that even a slowed breathing rate should have given me. Just an unyielding cold that didn't match a heated building in March. it felt almost like a corpse. I pulled my hand back fast enough to knock my clipboard off the side table, and by the time I'd bent to grab it and straightened back up, he was standing exactly where he'd been in the corner on that very first night, facing the wall again, like nothing between those two positions had happened at all. I didn't go back into that room for the rest of the shift. I called the facility's intake department the next afternoon, requesting confirmation from the transferring hospital about his history, hoping something in his prior records might explain any of it away. The woman I spoke with there took 2 days to get back to me, and when she did, she told me their system showed no patient by that name ever admitted to their facility. No transfer paperwork generated on their end matching the date or the file number ours had on record. Our own intake office called it a clerical mix-up between systems and said they'd follow up, and as far as I know, they never actually did. I put in for a ward transfer within the week, citing burnout, which by that point wasn't a lie at all. I work daytime now, in a different unit, brighter halls. I tried to find out where Elias Harmon actually came from, or where he went, since his bed showed a new occupant the following month. Nobody who still works overnight seems to remember him when I bring it up, which I've stopped doing now. I never planned on working in a funeral home. I answered an ad for overnight funeral preparation help, mostly because the pay was better than anything else I could find without a license in something specific. And 2 years later, I was still showing up at the same back door most nights of the week. Hollis Brothers ran out of a converted 2-story building on the edge of town, viewing rooms up front for daytime hours, a prep room and small cold storage area in the back where the actual work happened. Overnight, it was usually just me, sometimes a second assistant if 2 cases came in the same week, with one of the Holly's sons on call by phone in case anything needed a decision above my pay grade. Most nights, the work followed the same routine. A body would come in from a hospital or a home, and I'd spend a few hours on preparation, cleaning, dressing, positioning, whatever the family had requested for the viewing, then cover everything and log the time before moving on to whatever else needed doing before the day shift arrived. The building itself never scared me the way people assume working in a funeral home should. Quiet, but a working kind of quiet. Refrigeration units humming steadily in the back room. The hallway lights left on a dim overnight setting to save on the electric bill. I'd worked there long enough that the smell, the temperature, the particular silence of a building full of people who'd stopped needing anything from anyone had all become background noise to me. The night this happened, I'd spent close to 2 hours preparing an older man who'd come in from the hospital that afternoon, a routine case, natural cause, a viewing scheduled for the family 2 days out. I finished around 11, arranged everything the way the intake sheet specified, folded his hands over his chest, covered him with a clean sheet, and logged the time before heading down the hall for my usual break. I sat in the small staff room for close to 40 minutes, eating a sandwich, scrolling through shorts on my phone, the kind of break that blurs together with 100 others I'd taken in that same chair over 2 years. When I walked back into the prep room, something about the shape under the sheet looked wrong before I could name why. I pulled the sheet back and found his hands no longer folded across his chest, but down at his sides, palms up, and his head tilted a bit toward the door instead of facing straight up the way I'd left it. I stood there a moment, running through every possible explanation I could think of, but couldn't, and settled on believing I must have simply left him that way and forgotten. Since nothing else made sense, standing there alone in an empty building, I repositioned everything, refolded his hands, straightened his head, and went back to finishing the rest of my checklist. It bothered me longer than I wanted it to. Around 1 in the morning, alone in the break room again, I pulled up the security app on my phone, the one linked to the 2 interior cameras Hollis Brothers kept running, one covering the prep room One aimed at the back employee entrance we all used to come and go during a shift. The footage from my break showed the back door opening at 11:41, a full 10 minutes after I'd walked out to the staff room. Nobody used a key from outside. The door only opens from that side with a 4-digit code known to me, the two Hollis brothers, and one part-time assistant who hadn't worked a shift in weeks. A figure stepped through, hood up despite the mild night outside, and crossed the room directly to the table where the covered body lay. They stood over it for close to 2 full minutes without moving, then reached down and adjusted something at the chest, too brief and too angled for the camera to show clearly, before turning and walking back out through the same door at 11:53. The angle never caught a face, only the back of a hooded head bent forward the entire time, and the door showed no sign of having been forced, no damage to the frame, no alarm triggered on a system that logs every entry attempt automatically. I sat there replaying it 3 or 4 times before I made myself scroll back further, checking the saved footage from earlier that week, out of a growing unease I couldn't talk myself out of. I found the same figure twice more, one 4 nights earlier, one the week before that, always sometime after 11, always entering through that same door, always standing over whichever body happened to be on the table that particular night, before leaving the same way they'd come. I called one of the Hollis brothers at home, and to his credit, he came in within 20 minutes despite the hour, sitting beside me in the staff room to watch the footage himself. He went quiet in the same way I had, rewinding the clip twice on his own before finally reaching for his own phone to call the police, since neither of us could come up with an explanation for a repeat entry through a coded door that involved no forced access at all. An officer arrived close to 2:30 and reviewed the footage with us at length, taking down the exact times and dates of all 3 visits. One of them pointed out that the door code hadn't been changed in over a year, and that if it had ever been shared, intentionally or otherwise, with anyone outside our small staff, there'd be no record of it or any way to trace who might have it now. Without a clear face on camera and no physical evidence of forced entry, there wasn't an actual lead for them to follow, and recommended we change the code that night and consider upgrading the exterior camera angle. Before they left, I went back to check the body one more time, and that's when I found it, tucked into the folded hands I'd repositioned earlier, small enough that I'd missed it on my first pass. A photograph, old and worn soft at the corners, showing a young woman standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. It hadn't been logged among his personal effects, and the family hadn't mentioned anything about a photograph being included with him. I left before the end of that shift, telling the Hollis brothers I needed the rest of the night, which they understood without much explanation required. I didn't work another overnight shift alone after that, always requesting a second person scheduled with me from then on, even if it meant fewer hours. The family arrived the following afternoon to identify the body ahead of the viewing, and during the paperwork, the man's daughter mentioned, almost in passing, that her father had taken out a restraining order years earlier against someone who'd never actually been tracked down or identified by name, a case that had stayed open and unresolved right up until his death. She didn't offer more than that, and I didn't ask, though I thought about that photograph the entire time she spoke. But I couldn't help thinking the person in the camera footage was the same one the man's daughter had been talking about. I never learned who came through that door those 3 nights, or what exactly they were looking for standing over a body. Hollis brothers changed the door code the next morning, like the officers suggested, and as far as I know, nobody's come through that back entrance uninvited since.